What day is it?
It's my birthday.
It's good to share. But check you have the right privacy settings. Or someone can make a lot of money from being you.
This is an ABC podcast.
Hello there. It was the good war, even the just war. This week the world observes the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings, a crucial point in World War II. But did the Allies betray their own values in the way they fought a radical form of evil? I'm Andrew West. Welcome to the Religion and Ethics Report, a discussion with British writer Peter Hitchens about his controversial new book on the Second World War is soon. Let's start, though, by going to Melbourne and the Victorian Court of Appeal, where lawyers for the jailed Cardinal George Pell are arguing to overturn his conviction for child sexual abuse. In December, a jury found him guilty of abusing two teenage choir boys in the 1990s. In March, he was given a 6-year jail sentence. ABC Religion Unit Specialist Noel Debien has been in the court and joins us now. Noel, welcome.
Hello, Andrew.
Noel, it's a very big, a very consequential court hearing that's taken place this week. Literally, what is at stake?
The appeal here is over whether Australia's and one of the world's most important religious figures in terms of the Catholic Church will continue to serve his sentence, or whether he will be retried, or whether he will be set free. It comes down to that, and it's got worldwide attention, Andrew.
Yes, and you've noticed, indeed, international media in the court emphasising the sort of consequential nature of this.
Yes, German press are there, the New York Times are there, AAP is there, the press gallery is full, also the gallery around us is full. You can see that there are survivors, there are supporters of survivors, advocates. There are lots of people in that court very interested to see and very concerned about how this is going down.
The judges themselves seem to have been on the case, as it were, quite literally for several weeks. I believe the 3 appeal court judges have even made their own trip to the cathedral where the crimes are supposed to have been committed.
They have, and at the very beginning, the President, Justice Ferguson, made it clear that they had been reviewing evidence, they'd been preparing, and said that when Brett Walker SC makes his case, he can just point his finger onto certain things. He can talk about certain things he wants to emphasise, but that's not the whole of the evidence they'll be actually looking at or trying to decide upon. So it was made quite clear to the court that even when they're asking questions, and they're asking a lot of them, we're not to take away from that, oh, this is what they're thinking. They're trying to clarify in their minds what the advocates in there think are the important parts about all the evidence that they're reviewing. So this is basically a 2-day hearing where they can get in, both the defence and the prosecution can say, no, this is what you really need to focus on in our opinion, and they'll take that into account.
We said that a lot is at stake here, principally whether George Pell walks free from jail at the end of this process. What, in the broader scheme, is at stake here when it comes, for example, to the stories of sexual abuse survivors, just more broadly, beyond the George Pell case?
Well, it strikes me that what I've been listening to is really a to and fro about where the bar is set in terms of what a prosecution has to do to prove a case when there's a sexual assault against a child. How far do they have to go? How many things have to be ticked? How many T's crossed, I's dotted? And we're listening so far to arguments backwards and forwards about where the onus should be. And I think there's another case that's been mentioned, the Bauer case, which that's an anonymous case that went to the High Court, where the High Court threw it out and basically was setting the bar higher in favour of prosecution of child sexual abuse cases. And so there's that to consider in terms of our justice system, how it's adjusting to the Royal Commission and all the recommendations the Royal Commission has made in terms of how institutions should be dealt with. But then, of course, there's also the church matters that this affects, because should this appeal fail and should the Cardinal set out his sentence, the next thing that would happen will be the CDF, the Rome will have to decide. They will investigate, and they already are, as a matter of fact, what they're going to do. Will they actually laicise him?
And that, of course, means that he would cease to be a priest in any form. I believe that Cardinal Pell has indicated that should this appeal fail, he won't take it any further.
It appears to be the case. They're certainly not looking for a lower sentence. That's what I understand at this point. I don't know whether there could be further appeal, because certainly if there are three possible results, as you know, one of those could be the appeal is rejected. We don't actually give you leave because they're doing both at the same time. The other thing they could do is they could actually uphold the appeal on the basis that there was not enough evidence, and then he would be set free, actually, but then the prosecution could appeal to the High Court. But that could also happen, I presume, to the defence. The defence must have that open to them as well to appeal one more time if the prosecution could as well. I've not heard anybody talk about that, but that must be possible.
But this is, just finally, Noel, very high stakes, because if Cardinal Pell has indeed said, this appeal is it, if I fail, I will serve another 3 years and 6 months in jail. He will lose his position as a prince of the church. He'll lose his position in the church entirely. These are very high stakes for him.
They are high stakes in the sense that Cardinal McCarrick has been laicized. There was another case where a cardinal was found guilty and he is a layman now, and that's it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith at Rome will do the same thing with Cardinal Pell. There is a section of our culture and society that believes he's innocent and thinks this is the last chance to prove it. There are those people out there, and there are people inside the church who think that as well. And so it's not necessary that the CDF would follow, but it would seem to be likely, given the McCarrick case, that they would proceed to laicization should this appeal fail.
Good to talk to you, Noel Debien, ABC Religion Unit Specialist. Thanks for joining us, Noel.
Good to be with you.
And this is the Religion and Ethics Report, and you're with Andrew West. World leaders gathered in Portsmouth on England's south coast this week to mark the 75th anniversary of D-Day. That was the massive Allied military operation to take back Western Europe during World War II. The Second World War is widely considered a just war to defeat an extreme ideology of Nazism. But in a new book, British writer Peter Hitchens says that while the Allies were indeed fighting a radical evil, they sometimes used immoral methods. His book, The Phoney Victory, is especially critical of the Allies' carpet bombing of German civilians. Peter Hitchens joins us from Oxford. Peter, welcome.
It's always a real pleasure to be with you.
Peter, this book, The Phoney Victory, The World War II Illusion, is a controversial book. It's very compelling, it's very well written, but you don't dodge controversy. So let's establish, first of all, what you're not saying, and you are emphatically not saying that Britain should have made peace with Hitler. You are emphatically not denying the radical evil that was Nazism or the horrors that it perpetrated. So without getting into the specifics yet, what is your key argument?
The main reason for writing the book is about the present day. The use of what is frankly a mistaken understanding of World War II and how it came about is very frequent in advocacy for modern wars. Almost always when people are trying to persuade particularly democratic free countries to go to war and engage in wars of choice in recent years, the politicians who wish to do this will compare their proposed enemy with Hitler. They will attack those who are opposed to the war as appeasers and compare them with Neville Chamberlain, and they will often compare themselves with Winston Churchill or Franklin Roosevelt, or both of them at once. And this misunderstanding of war is both dangerous in terms of persuading people that often crises are far simpler and more obviously solved than they are. And secondly, in misrepresenting history, which is always bad, because if we don't understand our own memory and our own past, we will make mistakes on that basis. That's the real reason I wrote it. Initially, I wrote it because I was tired of being told that Saddam Hussein or Colonel Gaddafi or whoever it was, or Vladimir Putin now, was the modern Hitler. And then I realized not merely that these comparisons were stupid in themselves, but that they were a false representation of what happened in 1939 and 1940.
There's a very evocative description, these are your words, and very apt for our program. You say that World War II took on a, quote, pseudo-religious quality. What is the pseudo-religious quality of World War II?
It's become a sort of scripture. I think for a lot of people, certainly in my generation, this is the pictures in the mind of the retreat from Dunkirk, the pillar of fire by day and the pillar of cloud by night, the romantic moment of the finest hour of the few of the Battle of Britain pilots saving us from this great evil empire. The whole idolization of Winston Churchill into a figure far larger than any human being could possibly be is, again, almost scriptural. And I think for us, these stories became more powerful in our minds than such things as the parable of the Good Samaritan or the parable of the prodigal son or many, many biblical passages, which previously, I think, would have informed people's morality.
I think, though, Peter, that many listeners would surely agree that World War II, certainly compared with that wasted sacrifice, despite the millions of examples of individual bravery, but that largely wasted sacrifice of World War I, surely World War II was the good war of the two.
Well, I think that it probably makes a lot more sense to regard them as the same war. The Second World War was a continuation in many ways of all the combats and struggles and conflicts of the First. And I think what we tend to do in coming to our conclusions about the Second World War is simply closing our minds to aspects of it which would undermine its claims to be a good war. It just doesn't mean, and here I have to put in the caveat again, this doesn't mean that I think that the Hitler regime was not ultimately evil and didn't have to be defeated, because I do think both those things, it was ultimately evil, it did have to be defeated, but we have to recognize that in the conduct of that war, we allied ourselves with a power which may not have been quite as bad as the Third Reich, but was certainly comparable with it in terms of repression, violence towards its own people, and general uncivilized savagery, namely Stalin's Soviet Union. Next, we have to recognize a thing which in Britain it's almost impossible to discuss, which is that we deliberately, as a matter of policy, bombed German civilians in their homes and killed them. And thirdly, we have to look at the terrible consequences of the Potsdam Agreement and the mass expulsions and ethnic cleansing of Germans from Central Europe, which was conducted with appalling, unforgivable savagery, about which most people don't even know in the years immediately after the war. If you put these things into your understanding of it, it's much, much harder to make out that it was such a good war. It may have been a necessary war, which the First World War was not, but then again, it was made necessary by the leftover unfinished business of the First World War.
So, Peter, how then should Britain have dealt with its two major challenges, Hitler's treatment of his own people, the German Jews and the Roma populations in particular, and his expansionist ambitions in, Austria, Czechoslovakia, I think Eastern France, and then Poland? How should Britain have dealt with those?
The first thing you have to understand is that the campaign of industrialized systematic mass murder of Jews in particular in territory under German control did not begin until after the war had begun. The policy of the German state towards Jews before the war began was extremely savage, often violent and homicidal. The worst instance, of course, being the famous Kristallnacht in 1938. Where the state-sponsored pogroms took place, synagogues were burnt to the ground, many Jews were beaten to death, again, under state sponsorship. But the actual extermination program waited until the war had begun. So we didn't have, as a reason for acting, in 1939, the Holocaust, which many people now retrospectively imagine was one of the causes for our intervention. When we did learn, and we learned this through the extraordinary courage of people who smuggled the truth out of Central Europe, when we did learn of what was actually going on, and when we were urged to act in two ways, one by making it easier for Jews to flee from Europe, and the other way by bombing the railways that led to the extermination camps, we did nothing. Our attempts to give a moral justification to war by claiming that we fought it in some way to save the Jews of Europe from mass murder is simply not true. It wasn't a motivation for starting the war, and it wasn't something we were prepared to do once the war had begun.
Am I right in recalling from my history that the worst of the industrial scale genocide actually occurred in the last year or so of the war, in that frantic period when you can do things sort of under the cover of night, metaphorically?
The German phrase, Nacht und Nebel, night and fog, was one which they used for the hiding of a lot of the most wicked things that they did. It's undoubtedly easier in wartime to hide evil on this scale. There are other more complicated arguments about this, which I honestly don't enter into in the book, about the extent to which the extermination of the Jews was actually a consequence of the war beginning. I don't make that case. What I am saying is that we make a retroactive claim that we fought the war for this reason, but it wasn't so. We continued to have, right up until the outbreak of war in 1939, more or less normal diplomatic relations with the German state. We exchanged ambassadors. There was no attempt to break off relations because we disapproved of their internal policies. At that time, in general, I think most states tended to think the internal policies of other states were their own business, and it wasn't a reason for going to war.
Let's come to what you argue in the Phoney Victory is perhaps the greatest ethical challenge for those who posit World War II as the good war. Now, the Luftwaffe bombed London, Liverpool, Coventry. I think there was maybe 40,000 people killed in 1941. So surely when the Allies began their carpet bombing of Hamburg and later Dresden in something called Operation Gomorrah, Peter, wasn't this just a case of Germans getting their just desserts?
Oddly enough, at the beginning of the war, and this would have been the case with almost any statesman or politician in any civilized or Western country, we had a policy of not bombing civilians or populated areas. It was something that was just considered beyond the laws of civilized war to the extent that war can be fought in a civilized way. The international law had come very close before 1939 to banning the bombing of civilian areas. It didn't quite ever get ratified, but the general view was that it was entirely wrong. And the transformation of this view in civilized countries to one of almost gung-ho delight in the bombing, deliberate bombing of civilians, is extraordinary. The Germans certainly behaved with extreme savagery, but people were infuriated and distressed by it when they saw the consequences of it, and rightly so, because it is a disgusting form of warfare to drop high explosive and incendiaries on people in their homes, which seems to me to lead to the next question. If you think it was so bad for them to do it, and if you found the application of it to us and the terrible consequences of it and the deaths, as I say, of civilians, including women and children, in their homes under bombardment from the sky, then how can you possibly justify doing it yourself? You can't, is the simple answer. Certainly not if you're conducting anything remotely resembling a Christian war or imagining that you are in any way governed as a country by Christian morality. People argued very strongly against it at the time, including the late Bishop George Pell of Chichester, who stood up in the House of Lords and said what we are doing is totally wrong and we shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, and we should point out that Bishop George Pell, the Church of England bishop, he was not a pacifist. He didn't say there was never a case for war. He was quite selective in his criticism. I mean, selective in a good way.
He took military advice from Basil Little Hart about what he was going to say. He was very careful. And what's more, what he said in public reflected, interestingly, a secret struggle in Whitehall, which C.P. Snow wrote about in his Godkin lectures, over whether the bombing was militarily justified. By the way, you mentioned Hamburg and Dresden. I have to tell you, it was far, far more extensive than that. You need to read a book by Anthony Grayling called Among the Dead Cities, which gives a full list of all the German cities, dozens and dozens and dozens of them, cities you've never heard of in many cases, which were plastered with high explosive and incendiaries, often without any attempt to justify their destruction as military targets, because they weren't.
Let's stick with the morality of it, because one thing that I really learned from your book was that many of the cities, particularly Hamburg, that were carpet bombed, had in fact been the sort of last holdouts inside Germany against the Nazis. So in many respects, the Allies were bombing the people who were resistors as much as they could have been in Nazi Germany.
That is true. I was recently in the lovely old Hanseatic town of Lübeck, or what's left of it, which was selected deliberately as a target because it contained so many beautiful old wooden medieval buildings, and they wanted to see how well it would burn. And Lübeck had been so opposed to Hitler, it refused to let him visit in the days when he was still campaigning rather than actually became Chancellor. It had been a centre of opposition. Hamburg, again, very much a social democratic and pro-British city. But of course the other point about area bombing was that to be effective it had to be concentrated on densely populated working class areas. It was no good bombing middle class suburbs because the houses were too far apart. A lot of the explosives were wasted and the fires didn't spread. So the people who were bombed were more or less those who had been the last ones to continue to vote Social Democrat against Hitler, which many people very bravely did, even after it was clear that Hitler was in power. And these were the people who we were bombing. You can argue all kinds of things about German civilians, though I often wonder whether those who say, that they supported Hitler or they didn't resist him, how they would have behaved under such a regime with the Gestapo in their towns. I wonder how brave they would have been themselves. But you simply cannot argue that small children and babies, who are inevitably in quite large numbers the victims of these attacks, can possibly be made responsible for the actions of the regime under which they lived.
On the Religion and Ethics Report with Andrew West, I'm speaking with Peter Hitchens about Peter's newest book, The Phoney Victory, The World War II Illusion. In spite of all your criticism of the Hamburg and Dresden bombings in particular, you are very definite here that you reject any moral equivalence between the air raids and the Holocaust. You say, look, don't fall into that trap. So how could the Allies have won over the Nazis without these bombing runs?
Well, this is a very interesting question. Undoubtedly the case that the military effect of the bombing was not decisive, and arguments made for it that it saved us from invasion, for instance, are false, because by the time the bombing really got underway, the Battle of Stalingrad had already happened and there was no realistic threat that the Germans would turn westwards again. They were losing in the east. The only argument that is serious that can be made in favour of the bombing is that it diverted a large number of fighter aircraft from the Eastern Front. But this would also have been true of properly targeted daylight bombing of real military and industrial targets. On the rare occasions when it was attempted, was very successful, which would have diverted the fighters in the same way without being both wasteful and immoral. So it did not turn the scale of the war. The war in Europe was won, I have to say, and we really do need to admit this, was won by the Soviet armies and not by our bombing, which was almost a token to, in many cases, put forward by Churchill to appease Stalin when he complained, as he unceasingly did, about the refusal of the Allies to open a second front in Western Europe until very late in the war. That was one of the reasons for it.
One area where, again, you don't claim any moral equivalence, but you do come somewhat closer here, is the treatment of the ethnic German populations in Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, I think perhaps France as well, in the immediate aftermath of the war. What was the stated intention for those populations, stated at the Potsdam Conference in 1945 when the Allied leadership met?
Well, the stated intention was that the ethnic Germans were to be removed from these countries by what was called an orderly and humane process. And those who said this knew when they said it that it was a lie, because there had been previous such transfers of population, notably after the Greco-Turkish War in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And it's not orderly and it's not humane. It never is. It certainly wasn't. I can only commend people to read the passages in my book about this and the excellent and horrifying book upon which they're based.
Yeah, well, I'm going to read a passage.
Has that title, Orderly and Humane.
We're talking here about 12 to 14 million people who were transferred. Is that right?
I think that's about right. No one really knows.
What was the death toll of those post-war transfers of ethnic Germans?
No one really knows.
But you've got an estimate
of guesswork, yeah,
of up to 1.5 million.
Yeah, this is perfectly possible. The horrors of it were really very extensive indeed. The really astonishing thing about it is this huge event took place, and people don't even know it happened.
Well, here's one section, very powerful section of your book that I want to read. You've deliberately used blanks to let people guess or to give them a sense of what they might be thinking about. In a single incident, 265 blank, including 120 women and 74 children, were killed on June 18 by blank troops who removed them from a train at Horn Mostenice near Prerov, shot them in the back of the neck and buried them in a mass grave that they had been forced to dig beside the railway station. What is that a description of?
Well, it's a description of the massacre of German civilians by Czech troops. So it still makes me shudder to say it, because it's so unexpected as a fact, but it is. That's what it is.
It could be a description of German behaviour during the Holocaust.
Very much so.
I mean, the moral point that you seem to argue is that it's not about comparing these post-war Allied crimes with the horrific crimes of the Nazis, but you have to judge these post-war crimes by the Allies in themselves.
You do, and the fact that somebody else did something it's so terrible that it can barely be spoken of without despair does not mean that there is no remaining calculus on which other evils can be judged to be bad. You can't say because the worst thing in the world happened that all other moral judgments about your own actions are suspended. And what you must avoid absolutely is two things. One, the claim that these actions made us no better than the Nazis, which isn't true. And the other, the claim that the Nazi actions were so bad that what we did afterwards can be excused or forgotten, which is also not true. There is a point between those which is harder to bear, and this is the problem. Both of those things are easy conclusions for glib people to jump to. The point in between where I am is much harder to bear, much harder to live with, and makes judgments about the present and the future much harder to make. Well, that's a good thing. We should be more careful. Ever since the first time I saw what a human head looks like after a bullet has passed through it, ever since then I think I've been much more cautious about war. The purpose of history is, I think, to let people know what the consequences of present actions can and will be, and we should pay more attention to.
In the end, Peter, I think of a parallel between World War II and the American Civil War, and I remember that very compelling Ken Burns documentary series on the American Civil War. And I recall a historian, though, who said, look, the Civil War never started as a war to end the monstrosity or, the heresy that was slavery. But Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation during that war ultimately did elevate the Civil War morally. Couldn't we say the same thing about World War II, that despite all of the other agendas, Britain trying to hold on to its place as an imperial country and territorial disputes in Europe, couldn't we ultimately say, though, that World War II put our foot on the throat of the most radical evil of our time, and in that sense we can justify it?
Well, yes, I think you can say that, but having once said that, that doesn't prevent you from saying, did we fight it in the right way at the right time? Could we have fought it differently? Could we have fought it more morally and done fewer bad things on our own part in the course of defeating that evil? And I think the answers to all those questions are probably yes. And I think that consideration is the one I would like people to come away with. I think that the war ultimately had to be fought at some point. But look, here is the most startling thing. Britain in 1939 was not a trivial or a weak or a poor country, and nor was France. These were two very considerable powers, not great powers by the standards of the superpowers of today, but two very considerable powers. And they started a war at the wrong moment, on the wrong issue, which they, in France's case, they lost and were then subjected to the most appalling subjugation, during which they were compelled, for instance, to hand over French Jews to be murdered by the Germans, a shame on France, which it will never, as far as I'm concerned, expiate. And Britain came within inches of being in the same position. Now, that's not competent diplomacy. The whole thing only needed to shift a few inches to the left or the right, and we would have been cooperating with Germany in the twilight of Europe. It was a very close-run thing. Why did we take this risk? And we didn't need to. And I think that this is the most serious point in my book, that an awful lot of the reason why we dashed into an ill-timed, ill-prepared war, which we very nearly lost, was national vanity.
Peter, thank you as always for giving us a lot to think about. Peter's latest book is The Phoney Victory, the World War II Illusion, and it's compelling and it's provocative to speak about it in this, the 80th anniversary of the declaration of World War II. Peter, as always, thank you for joining us on the Religion and Ethics Report.
Well, thank you very much for having me on.
And there's a longer version of my discussion with Peter Hitchens at the Religion and Ethics Report homepage at the RN website. And if you want, sign up to the Religion and Ethics newsletter. Just go to abc.net.au/religion and subscribe at the bottom of the page. Thanks to Mutter Tadias and Bryce Halliday. I'm Andrew West. Back next week.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.